Okay. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I know we're still waiting for Jennifer, but it's 7:03, and we should begin. We do have a quorum, so we should begin the December meeting of the Planning Commission. All members are present, except for Jennifer. What's that? And Chloe Moore is with us from Montgomery County Planning Commission. And is there anyone in the public on YouTube?
There's Ira Winston.
Ira, Eric, I see Eric Johnson. Good evening, Eric.
Barbara Fortner, Councilperson Fortner is here.
Okay. Is Kevin Walsh with us?
I don't see Kevin.
Okay. So we have two members of the public and the borough engineer. Okay. Does anyone need a copy of the minutes? Or not the minutes, the agenda? Okay. And we'll move on. All right, so the first item on the agenda tonight is Chair's update. I have, until about 3 o'clock, I didn't have the update, but I now have an update. So hat off press update, courtesy of Jim Spear. Jim Spear, would you like to give an update in my stead?
Sure. So we received, or I received, data of lot coverage, building coverage and lot coverage.
Impervious coverage.
Impervious coverage and building coverage as separate pieces. And I compiled them into a database. So we have that information available to us now.
Where did that come from?
MCPC.
From my colleague in the GIS.
It's accurate as of 2015 is the last time they updated that data. So anything since then is going to have to be taken with a grain of salt. But it's at least a very good approximation about coverage data.
So Jim has integrated that into the base Excel file with all of our other data, and a little later tonight when we get into our agenda item about potential zoning revisions, we can talk about how we might use that data to inform some of the things we need to figure out. So I asked Jim how that actually happened. He said it was through sheer persistence.
So it's building coverage?
And impervious coverage.
Both. We have both figures.
For every lot?
Every lot in our
How can you get impervious?
So I was wondering about that. I think it probably is dependent on, building application stuff, like when you put a garage down, they must know about it.
Typically, it would be done with a survey, like an aerial survey, where you take high resolution imagery, and someone just traces it in CAD, GIS, and there's usually a menu of surface types. So a group of those surface types will be classified as impervious.
That's my best guess as to how it was done. I can find out more though.
Wow.
Shows up missile silos also.
That's one of the surface coverage.
That's one. Yes.
The opening.
By magic, that's how
It's the same
GIS
technology,
can do
though,
things.
as I understand it.
So we've been waiting for that information for a long time, and now we're glad we have it. Thanks to your colleagues, Chloe.
I will do that, definitely.
So that is some good news. And I have, Jim gave me a copy of the Excel file, so if any of you would like the Excel file, we can. Okay, the second item is approval of the November minutes. I was only able to finish them this morning and send them to you. I wanted to ask if anyone had a chance to look at them or would like to make a motion to approve the minutes from our November meeting.
I looked at them, it looked like everything was lined out.
What do you mean?
The whole first
Straight through the font.
Ah, well, I'll take a look at that.
That may just be a font thing.
Yeah, and was it transcribing from something on?
No, I didn't. No, let me take a look real quick. It could be because I hope I didn't send you the wrong file.
You might have, because it was also hard to read this.
Maybe we should just come back to that next month.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we will table that. We can find out what happened with those minutes. Okay, the third item is to establish a meeting schedule for 2022. Now, normally we meet the first Monday of the month. There is one issue we always look at, which is Labor Day, because that falls on the first Monday of the month. But Dave and I checked, and as far as we know, that does not create, we have flexibility to reschedule without being concerned about conflicts with the Jewish holidays, because they occur late this year. So the meeting normally would be September 5th, Monday, September 5th. So our option would be to schedule it on Tuesday the 6th or Monday the 12th. For those of you keeping score at home, Rosh Hashanah does not begin until September 25th, so there's no conflicts there. So does anyone have preference as to whether we meet on the first Tuesday or the second Monday?
Well, traditionally, we've gone to the second Monday in September, and the sky has not fallen.
Does it make
Well,
any
it's around
difference?
September 11th, that's not a good analogy. We take your point.
Does it make any difference when the council meeting is? I mean, because a lot of times you like to.
Yeah, well, I don't know what council's schedule is. They have not set it yet. All I hear is they may meet on Thursdays instead of Wednesdays, but nothing is determined. So their meeting would normally be on the first Wednesday or the 7th. So that would argue for meeting on the 6th in case we have any business we want to get to council for its workshop. You know, in the past few months, council's been pretty flexible and allowed us to have presentations at its business meetings, so I'm not sure. I think really at this point I would say what works better for us. And Jim has said Monday the 12th. Does anyone else have any feelings about that? Okay, so we'll meet Monday the 12th. And the other issue, which is trickier, is January.
But before we switch to is there an issue with October with before? I'm wondering.
Let me check right now. Yom Kippur, Iraq Yom Kippur is Tuesday the 4th.
Okay.
And then it continues on the 7th.
Okay.
Excuse me, the 5th.
Okay.
So Monday the 3rd comes the day before Yom Kippur Eve.
So it's Monday night. Does it say when Yom Kippur begin on Monday night or on Tuesday night?
My calendar says Yom Kippur Eve is Tuesday the 4th and Yom Kippur is the 5th.
Okay.
Is that how that would be conventionally expressed? Because I know it's a 2-night holiday. So Yom Kippur Eve would be the first night, then the full day.
Okay, it's the first night that's the issue. If it's Tuesday night, then we're okay.
Yeah, that's what it says. We can, if for some reason we've miscalculated the moons, we can recalibrate. But according to the calendar now. And then January 3rd is New Year's Day observed, I believe. So my question, and then council would be on the 5th, and we are likely to have something we want to bring to them the 5th, which is zoning changes, and so I'd like to know if we could meet on the 4th, Tuesday, January 4th. That'd be all right? The other option would be just to meet on the 10th. Is that okay, Jim?
When is the reorganization meeting?
I'm sorry, the 3rd is when the reorganization meeting is, yeah.
Okay.
That's the conflict. Okay. The conflict is the reorganization meeting is the 3rd. So council meets on the 3rd to reorganize, and then they would have a regular meeting later.
Later in that week?
Well, depends on what they agree to do. I don't know. When they reorganize, they'll figure out that.
Okay.
That's from what I know. So we can meet on Tuesday the 4th.
I want to keep it in Jim's method of following them.
The idea for reason for meeting the 4th is in case council meets that first week in its workshop, we might want to be able to review things to send to them for their workshop, since we're working on zoning changes. So that would be the reason for doing that.
whatever.
And then every other meeting would be on the first Monday, 7th, 4th, 9th, 4th. Well, actually, no, July 4th is a Monday too, so we have to find another day for that. Would we just then pick the 11th? Okay.
People will be away. And going to the 11th.
So on July
Is we skip the August meeting, is that, there's no meeting in
Yeah,
August?
we skipped meetings back in the days when
Yeah.
we didn't have such a packed agenda.
Yeah, I long for those days.
Yeah, those days had something to recommend them, but that is not the case now.
Yeah,
I long for it becoming the case again.
But we can always see when we get closer to the day.
Pardon me?
We can see when we get closer to the day.
yeah.
Let's cancel a meeting. It's easier to cancel than to advertise a new one. Okay, so that will be our schedule.
What was the last change you just made?
Instead of meeting on July 4th, which is a Monday, we'll meet on July 11th, which is the second Monday. Okay, and then the last item I have is, it was brought to my attention by the borough office that we are required to provide an annual report to council. In addition to whatever reports that we might submit in the course of the year, like the letters we write and minutes. I've been told it since we correspond pretty thoroughly with council and the public about our business, that this is not a big matter, but formally we have to do it, which I think would which would mostly probably mean that we would write a letter which summarizes the major things we worked on, like the historic district ordinance and zoning changes, reference the letters we've already transmitted, and call it a day. What I wanted to ask is if someone could volunteer, and that's not due until March 1st. So I'd like to know if someone in January and March wouldn't mind, or February, writing up that 1 or 2 page letter that we can send to council. Any volunteers?
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay. All right, so Jim will provide that.
I may require reminding.
Okay. Well, if Michelle Carroll's listening, she will.
I know, I have no hope.
Okay, that is all I have in terms of announcements and updates. So are there any announcements or updates from anyone else? Anything besides the salvo, Chloe, to report on?
I hope that maybe some of you heard about this, but we're updating the countywide hazard mitigation plan, and there's a meeting tomorrow at noon, and then the same meeting again the following day at 6 p.m. That's open to the public for information about the hazard mitigation plan update process, and you can share your ideas or just learn about what's going on. So if you'd like to attend that, it's not too late. I'll try to put a link in the chat. Not right the second, but should be interesting. It's important. That's pretty much it, I think, though.
Okay. Okay, so on our agenda tonight, we have 2 items of old business. One is further discussion of the draft saldo ordinance, and then another is the further discussion of infill housing and accessory dwelling unit zoning amendments. In regard to the discussion of the draft saldo ordinance, last week we did receive a new revision of the draft as well as a memo related to street design standards from Chloe. So I will let Chloe explain to us what those are, where things stand, and what you're hoping to hear from us tonight.
Thank you. Yes, so was a draft circulated, or the next draft of the plan processing and review section. Just to clarify, the memo is not related to the plan processing and review section. We'll get to that in a second. But plan processing and review, we attempted to update based on the comments that you all had last month, and Lower Merion released their draft saldo rewrite for public comment, and we reviewed that and incorporated it's like a sentence here, a paragraph here, a few things that we thought they did nicely. We were inspired to make a few other changes. So plan processing and review, the primary question for you is, did we address your concerns related to the primary concerns were related to requiring renderings, elevations, photographs. So for the sketch plan, just photographs are required, and then for the preliminary plans, preliminary renderings and photographs, and then a location map drawn to scale showing the relationship of the tract surrounding road network properties, buildings on the block. So it's basic locations of all the buildings on the block shall be shown but need not be surveyed. And then for the final plan, more detailed renderings and elevations should be included. Fully developed architectural renderings, a list of exterior building materials, and building elevations. So yeah, and then the only other thing that I sort of thought we might talk about briefly is under the tentative sketch plan filing and review procedure, there's this list of aspects that should be discussed. And the list has gotten very long. Well, I don't know if it's not that long, but I wonder if we want to focus on a few things in sort of thinking about the tentative sketch review as more of a charrette workshop kind of thing, to just choose a few of these that are sort of the main things for discussion, rather than listing, these aspects should be discussed: the location of proposed access points, the extent and configuration of buildings, parking lots, etc. Maybe it should just be more broad. Something like what's in there is letter B, the compatibility of the proposal with respect to the objectives and policy recommendations of the comp plan, open space plan, and other plans. The consistency with neighborhood character and impact on neighbors and neighboring properties. So if you haven't thought on, we can leave it like it is, or if you want to just trim it to a couple kind of big picture thoughts about how to review that. So that's plan processing and review. I'm open to your comments.
So we can bundle that into two big topics then. One is, do the revisions you've made to the plan processing and review capture the comments we made? And then secondly, you'd like to have a little feedback or discussion on that one section, which I think is on the bottom of page 3. Okay. The things that are evaluated. Okay, so let's take the first question.
One thing to say is we're going to be doing the infill next.
What's that?
The person who's not muted is making noise.
Are we trying to?
Michelle, can you mute the public?
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. I guess one thing, Chloe, is these just came in one day last week, so has anyone else, I know I had a chance to look at them Saturday, has anyone else had a chance to look at them yet?
Briefly,
Okay.
not exhaustively.
Okay. Okay, well then, I'm open, if anyone has any comments or feedback for Chloe about whether this captures our comments, it's a good time to...
Well, I think I will jump in here, not surprisingly. I think the revised draft does pay some attention to the issue of treating the context, but I don't think it goes far enough. On page 2, item C2, it says you've added, I think, photographs would show the context of the property within the block and neighborhood. Elsewhere, it talks about 2 photographs, somewhere else in the text, which isn't nearly enough to capture and convey the context, in my opinion. If you have a row of buildings, let's presume they're houses, because most of the time they will be. You have a row of them, and you're proposing a new one, or you're proposing some major change to one in the middle of the row. You really need to see a substantial part of that row in pretty much orthographic fashion in order to convey the look and feel of the row, I think. And 2 photographs, I can picture somebody going out there with their Polaroid camera and going click, click, and calling it a big fat day. And that's not going to cut the mustard, in my opinion. So in the old days, we would have drawn all that stuff, you know? You would have drawn an elevation. And that way you'd see the proportions and the scale of each of all the items in the row that you are trying to insert your project into. That would be the old school way of doing this. Today we might settle for a row of photographs down the street, some number of adjacent structures, so that you can assemble them and see the context pretty clearly photographically without forcing somebody to hire cheap labor to go and draw it all. But 2 photographs is clearly, in my view, clearly not enough. So I would like to elaborate in the text here about what we mean by the context of the property within the block. I know what I would expect to see is a whole bunch of photographs sufficient to paint a fairly elaborate picture. This is not expensive work to ask an applicant to do. Film is cheap these days. But we should definitely ask for that early on, so that early in the design process and review process, we can make it very clear to an applicant that they are or are not getting the message about fitting into context. I think that's crucial in the world of form-based code. So I think it's the earlier in the process we can get an applicant to commit to something that represents the look and feel of the context of the street, the better everyone's going to be. If we wait for detail until the end, it's too late. They're committed and they're going to resist like crazy making any changes, because it turns out their idea of the scale of the street doesn't comport with, with the Planning Commission's idea of what that should be. So I want to see them express it early and get the feedback early. And that should be the guiding principle, in my opinion.
Well, the tentative sketch plan, and this is, you're referring to the tentative sketch plan? As
No, I'm just referring to the whole thing. Last month, when we talked about this, I think the consensus was that the preliminary plan is the time to do this.
Okay, so I just want to clarify, because the tentative sketch plan is the first section that says photographs are required, and that doesn't talk about quantity, and that's also
right.
just the recommended phase. So I guess what you were asking, Chloe, was should we make the tentative sketch plan requirements more of a summary rather than a list? I mean,
we can consider that actually, and I have seen for tentative sketch plans something like just the applicant may submit basically whatever they want to, and we'll try to just chat about it in an informal way. But I was talking about a different section of the tentative sketch plan information a minute ago, and that was the very last part of the tentative sketch plan filing and review procedure, where it says, talks about that the Planning Commission is going to discuss all of this information with the applicant, and it says aspects of the tentative sketch plan that shall be specifically evaluated include but are not limited to, and then there's this long list.
Where does that show up in here?
It's the bottom of page 3 and the top line of page 4.
What number is that? I'm sorry, I'm looking at something that doesn't have page numbers.
133-6-6.
The end part of 133-6. So I prefer to get to 133. 113-7. They should both be 113.
Yeah.
Is it like both?
113.
Oh, it should be 113-6?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, is it four?
Yeah. I'm scheduled to pour, but only briefly.
So, I mean, I was concerned that it was really a lot. And I was wondering if there's a way to consolidate. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think it all needs to be in there, but I'm just wondering if asking an applicant to read through all of this, is there a way to consolidate?
You're just talking about the overall length of the document.
Yeah, well, and maybe the tentative sketch plan phase specifically, because it is a recommended phase, and as you just very nicely said, bring what they can basically put together to describe the project.
Yeah, I do think that could be the tentative sketch plan. Requirements list could be abridged a bit, if that's desired, as well as this aspects to review. And then preliminary plan and final plan submission requirements, it might be possible to put at least some of them into a table rather than text. But
Well, in terms of the,
it's not unusually long for sections.
the requirements for sketch plan, why don't we talk about those when we talk about your second question?
Right, sounds good.
Just maybe hide in the answer to your question will come up. Then we talk about what happens back to the formal.
So,
Is there any other?
To clarify my comments, I'm perfectly happy to leave all this until the preliminary phase and not be burdensome in the tentative sketch plan phase, if we have a tentative sketch plan phase, which it looks like we're going. There was some question last time. And it is maybe burdensome when an applicant is trying to figure out how many boxes he can fit on the site. But we shouldn't let it go any beyond the preliminary
No, I agree.
phase in order to nail that down.
No, I agree.
Does anyone else? I have a few, but I want to wait and see if anyone else has any comments. So I have a couple comments, Chloe. I don't want to go through, I have a lot of small ones. I think it's better for me just to mark it up and send it to you.
sure, that works.
So I think there's a couple of, some are general and some are worth bringing up. So the first general comment is, if you look at, as an example, if you look at the top of page 5, there's preliminary plan submission requirements, B7. It says a list of the dimensional and density requirements of the applicable zoning district, right? Well, our code doesn't have density requirements per se. So I feel like that's language that's left over from some like pseudo language from somewhere else. We regulate, the form-based code does regulate through zoning districts, site plan standards, building standards, and then there's a supplemental standards. That's the general way our code is organized. And so I think that to the extent possible, the saldo should refer to the actual aspects of our code, where that is appropriate.
I'll take another look through for that stuff, but feel free to point it out to me if you.
Okay, that's a general. The second general comment is, example here is on page 8. This is for, it's a continuation of preliminary plan subdivision or submission requirements. And it's about proposed improvements, features, and lotting plans. following information should be shown, and it says 1A, proposals are consistent with the need to minimize flood damage. Plans should be shown to assure that proposals are consistent with the need to minimize flood damage. Now, that's a good thing, except that, how do you evaluate that? Right, this is a submission requirement, but it's saying you have to draw it to meet a standard. So that standard should actually appear somewhere else, right? So I think that probably we should flag requirements that are written as standards as opposed to helping us understand whether submission meets a standard somewhere else in the code. Same is true with 1C. Adequate drainage is provided. So I think there probably would say something like, drawn to assure proposals can be evaluated for compliance with the stormwater code or whatever. So that's the second general comment. I think the third general comment appears around page 12 and 13. I'm having trouble, like in 11 and 12, following the timing. The Narberth, so number 11 says the Narberth Borough Council should have a 90-day time period to act on the plan, but it doesn't say when the starting point is. And the reason I don't want to make an assumption about that is because in the last meeting, the borough manager said they're exploring different ways to determine when the clock starts. So that should probably be clear.
Right, that's in below it. So 11 has letters A and B below it.
Right, so I have a question about that.
Okay.
So the 90-day time period shall be measured from the date the Narberth Planning Commission reviews the application or 30 days following the plan filing date. Is that actually legal?
Well, so your solicitor did have a look at this. I don't know in how much detail he looked at it, but the MPC says that the plan should be reviewed at the next planning commission meeting after the plan is submitted, and the clock starts then, or it starts within 30 days if the planning commission does not meet within 30 days.
Okay.
And I've seen in communities interpret that as so long as the clock starts within 30 days of the submission, that you're okay. You know what I mean? So like if the planning commission meets the day after the submission comes in, it doesn't really make sense for you to review it then. And so if the planning commission doesn't review it within those 30 days, then the clock has to start 30 days after the plan is submitted. So that's the intention there. And if your solicitor is comfortable with it, then that's what I would advise.
Okay, well that helps me. So that helps me. One thing I'm wondering if it should be explicit is 13F. This is about resubmissions. If the resubmission is determined to be considered a new plan, the borough shall so from the applicant that the borough shall consider the 90-day review procedure to have been restarted as the date of the filing of the substantial amendment. So if it's considered to be a new plan, why wouldn't the other time rules apply? And the 90-day period starts within, you know what I'm saying, like a couple months.
Right, no, that makes sense. It shouldn't start from the date the new plan was submitted. It should start from the date that the planning commission reviews it or 30 days after it was submitted, whichever is sooner.
Because it's a new submission, it's just like
It's
nothing
counted
ever
as a new
happened before.
submission.
Right?
Yep.
So the other thing is, what I believe would be the case is if it's a new submission, then the new submission would be governed by the codes that are in effect at the time of the new application, not at the time of the previous application. Right?
That's an interesting question. I think if the plan was never denied or rescinded by the applicant, that there's still some vested right from the original submission. But again, I think the guys checking with your solicitor on that.
Well, I think it would be good to get the solicitor's advice. I can see this cutting both ways. we may wish for new submissions to be reviewed under the most current zoning code possible, right? On the other hand, if every time an application is considered a new submission and kicks you into new code, applicants may be unwilling to revise their applications. And so we might lose flexibility in that way. So strategy-wise, I don't know what the best answer is, but it would be interesting to know what the solicitor's opinion is.
Yes, it would.
Everything else I have is just quirky organizational things, so I don't think it's worth taking our time on.
Okay, let me know later. And in terms of Jim Cornwall's comment, is there a feeling in the group of, should we include a minimum number of photographs with the preliminary plan? And if so, what should that minimum be? Or is there a specific way you want me to amend the text to say more about what they're supposed to show?
I don't think we can stipulate a number of photographs. I think we have to rely on some softer language, such as sufficient to portray the totality of, I'm making up the wrong words here, but sufficient is the word that we should probably build this.
Adequately describe.
Adequately describe the context of the entire, the environs. I would use general language, because if they come in with two photographs of the house next door on either side, you're going to say that does not adequately describe the context of this block of this street. Go back and take some more pictures for us. So if you say 17 photographs, that would be stupid, because who's to say 17 is the right number? But there's probably a legal conundrum here, because you want to be able to nail it down so that the developer can't squirm his way out of.
Well, you could say something like adequately describe no fewer than, I'll say 5. You know, that gives us the opportunity when we see it to say, no, you're going to have to take.
Well, can you do the whole street in 5 photographs? Can you portray the whole?
Well, I don't know, but
look at us sitting there.
No, but what I'm saying is, if you say that, but you give the reviewers the wiggle room to say, no, we don't think you've adequately described it.
That's what we want people to do.
Right.
Right. So I don't know how to say that in a way that's binding.
Maybe, Chloe, do you understand the point that's being made? Is it something you could figure out language to?
I can certainly take a stab at it. And my recommendation would be to keep some kind of minimum in there, even though I understand that you could take, 20 pictures of one bush and it would obviously not be adequate. But there's this first phase where it's sort of a technical review done by borough staff, like, did the person submit the number of photographs required? They have to sort of check. And if there's no minimum, it's not impossible, but it's harder for them to evaluate, well, did they actually submit what they were supposed to have submitted?
Yeah.
But I can make it up, the number too, if you want.
It was easy, anybody could do it, Chloe. Even I would have been able to pick a number.
It seems like the standard could be a spatial standard instead of a count. So I don't know, whether that's 100 yards in each direction or 50 yards in each direction, or the block face on each side. Whatever the appropriate standard is.
Are you allowed to say something like 2 photographs, or no fewer than 2, or numbers sufficient to depict, the entirety of the block, or something like that?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be 2, we could say 5 or 10 or some other number.
Yeah, I would pick a bigger number.
Yeah.
We can pick
If you're going to pick any
that's no
number,
problem.
make it 10 there.
And we can use some spatial language as well. But, I mean, Adam brings up a good point too. Do we want the block face on the same side as the parcel in question, the entire block face on that side? Do we want both block faces? Do we want sort of stand in the middle and look down the whole street? I mean,
What if you're on a corner lot?
what if you're on a corner lot? I mean, maybe we should try to describe it a little more clearly.
Okay, well, I like that idea. Why don't we say 50 yards,
Well,
150 feet?
at a minimum, it has to be the block, because a lot of our metrics are based on the block.
Yeah. So we should ask for the whole block.
Yes.
And in the case of a corner lot,
Both blocks.
Both-
Because the
both.
metrics depend on both blocks.
right.
And
That's
it's
what
just
we
your
should
side
have.
of the street that matters? Your
Our
block?
metrics only involve your side of the street.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, that's helpful.
Let's do it that way. That's,
Yeah, I don't think we have any metrics that involve both sides of the street.
Not anymore. Can I ask a question? New question?
Sure.
So there's some housing types that we're considering that may have a floor area limit on them. Is there any stage of application that's appropriate to submit to document the floor area of a new structure?
Good question.
Well, you can just make a note of that.
Yeah,
We can,
okay.
okay. We don't need to solve that right now. I think you've already said, Chloe, that you're watching the proposals we're making, and we'll make sure that the requirements provide the information needed. So
Yes, we
June
did.
is correct in flagging that
Yeah.
as potentially a new metric.
That's a good point, as we discussed last time, I think there's a few areas that will probably need to be revised depending on what ends up going through in terms of the new housing types.
In the interest of time, Chloe, I would hope that since we only received this within the last week or so, that we can mark this up and send you further comments.
Sure, please do.
So I encourage you all, if you have other comments, just to mark it up and send it directly to Chloe. But you do have a second question on the table, which is what happens at the tentative sketch plan review, that's right?
Right. And how should we convey that in this document here?
Okay, so the last meeting we brought up the notion that it's possible to think about it as more like a charrette, a qualitative review. I guess I'd like to ask if anyone on the commission would like to kind of dig into that idea and talk about what you'd really like what you think would be most valuable to chew on at the tentative phase, which as recall, that the recommendation of the borough manager and planning consultant is the tentative phase would not be a phase where official approval is granted. It's an advisory, voluntary advisory stage. So what are your thoughts about what we really ought to be looking for in that phase?
Well, I think certainly the most successful projects that we've had, in my view, have been the ones where there's been some collaborative initial effort. Not necessarily, as you say, something that's binding, but where there's a, kind of open and free, fairly informal exchange of ideas about what's important to us and what's important to the property owner. Some work product is kind of derived from that sort of describes it, but not in a way that necessarily binds them to kind of future design development.
so what does that look like?
Well, I'm not sure. I think at the minimum it's a written list of bullet points of items that were discussed. Presumably with laying out the opinions, the preferences of the planning commission, regarding that particular item of the design. And I think the question is, what's the goal of this first effort? Is it to try to bind them to something, or is it try to get a dialogue going, and a kind of an interchange of ideas that will be collaborative through the rest of the project? Again, in my experience, the most successful projects have been the ones where a collaborative, atmosphere was established early on.
Well, in that vein, the outline that you have is a guideline. Could be looked at as a guideline.
Yeah.
I mean, it does address a lot of points that people may not be thinking about, would be helpful. So.
I mean, the other aspect of this, which is always the difficult one, is as much as we'd like specificity, we're talking about context and we're interested in what the thing looks like, we inevitably get the pushback of, well, it's too early in the project for us to make those decisions. We don't have the pro forma yet to tell you what the materials are, and that kind of thing. And I appreciate the bind that the developer may be in. As much as I would like to, say, well, right, that's just a color on a drawing. What are you really thinking about here? Is that driving or is it limestone?
That's not really a conversation at that point, right?
That's not really what?
That's not really a conversation at that point in the process, right?
Well, it could be, but it likely isn't. I mean, again, I think our problem in the past has been that these things do get pushed aside, and then we get blindsided later on to find out that nebulous drawing, which really doesn't say anything, ends up being something that we would have liked to have had input more specifically earlier on to direct it in another direction.
Well, as I imagine the way this process works, the first thing you want to understand is how many structures are going to go on this, are proposed to go on this site, and roughly where are they going to be? Are they going to be in a row in the front of the site? Are they going to be in a row in the rear of the site? Most Narberth sites don't even have enough area to have that kind of question arise. But it's a question of how densely packed are we going to be with this project? It's what it really boils down to in our little borough here. And that's been demonstrated over and over and over again. And we want to know that we want to walk out of that stage of review with there being no question about that level of design. That is the first level of design, really. And based upon that level of design, the developer can go confidently forward with the financial pro forma of his project, pretty much.
Right.
The rest of it's just icing on the cake, as far as the developer's concerned.
I don't necessarily agree completely, because again, as a form-based code, emphasis on the word form, while that stuff is kind of central to the development of the project, right there behind it is, and what does this thing look like in terms of the form and the context?
Right.
And I would like, for one, I would like to hear what the developer has in mind at that early stage in terms of what the form is too.
I doubt we're gonna find developers who can,
Well, and I'll give an example. The 114 Forest, I got to hand it to those guys. They, very, very early on, they had that palette of materials, and I don't know how they managed to do it, but they ended up getting through the entire project. And they're building something that they showed us very early on.
Yeah.
And we really, unlike some other projects like I mentioned, we had a very, very clear idea of what they had in mind.
So I want to try and get this to a ground where we can kind of move on, because the language here that's proposed, which Chloe's saying is a way we can consolidate it. Two of the items say compatibility proposal with respect to objective and policy recommendations, comprehensive plan, etc., and consistency with neighborhood character, impact on neighbors and neighboring properties. I mean, the word evaluated might not be the right word, but those are certainly topics to discuss, right?
Mhm.
And we can put that language in the code, and if you're in the room when that conversation occurred, you can ask about the material, right? You can ask them what they're thinking. But it also could mean other things that other people. So I think, Dave, you're concerned about that level of detail could be part of the conversation, initiated as part of the conversation under those aspects of the evaluation which are listed here. I think, Jim, you're suggesting there's some basic site planning and massing that we need to know, right? So site planning, massing, uses, just fundamental things. How the developer believes this is compatible with the block and the neighborhood. I think we've learned that the discussion of how a site will be accessed and how parking and circulation will work are worth talking about as early as possible, because we've had lots of snags in that regard.
Yep.
And I think that tends, I think those things, use, site planning, massing, circulation, access, compatibility, if we say those are the goals of the conversation, that allows us to put on the table just about any concern that tends to come up.
yeah,
And even if there's not a good answer, the point is not to come up with binding answers. The point is for us to be able to share our thoughts about that, right? So Dave, even if they don't know what materials they're going to use, you could say, well, look at all the buildings on this block and look at the materials they've used, okay? I'll walk along with you and I'll show them to you to see how they work, right? So I think those, if we boil it down to 6 or 7 basic points, that gives us the entree to bring just about anything we are interested in to the table.
I agree. To me, the essential point of that first conversation is to be able to say, here's what's important to me or to us in this project.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if there's not a answer.
Right.
So Chloe, that might make it a little simpler.
Yeah, that's helpful. I can consolidate this a little bit while leaving much of this here.
Well, I think it's interesting too what you were saying about basically when they bring in the submission for plan commission review, whoever is accepting it can just check off the boxes that there's enough material there to make it worth our while.
Now, does that naturally?
When I mentioned that a minute ago, I was talking about the preliminary plan.
But even in this kind of review, it would be helpful too.
Right. There is still a process for this by which the borough staff has to accept the submission and put it on the agenda of the planning commission.
Right. So there need to be a certain amount of items submitted, I guess.
Right. There's a little bit of a conflict, not conflict. So you want, it's optional, in the way this draft is written, to submit a tentative sketch plan at all. And you really want to encourage applicants to do it because, as you've all mentioned, it's very valuable for the applicant. They may not recognize it until they go through the process, but certainly for the borough. It's very valuable for them to hear your feedback before they get into a lot of expensive engineering and architectural renderings, et cetera, that are not required for the tentative sketch plans. So you don't want to make it too arduous to submit it, or people will say, oh, I'll skip that. But at the same time, you want to request items that will be useful for the discussion, so you'll be able to have the conversation. So it's up to you if you want to have certain things that are required for this submission, or just items that are recommended.
I'd like to go through your list
Okay.
and maybe kind of just highlight things that would be helpful to have, even at the tentative sketch plan phase.
Sounds good. Let me know.
Okay.
It's on page 2.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Are there any other comments from anyone else about the kind of nature of this tentative discussion, tentative sketch plan discussion? Does that make sense to you? Okay. And then if you have comments about specific things, just mark up your copy and send it. Okay. So the last thing on this particular topic is, Chloe, you have sent us a memo, street sidewalk width requirements and zoning in Saldo. Now I think I read it over. I don't see a way that we can comment on this, and I don't know that we need to tonight. So are you just giving this hopefully just for our information for further conversation later?
Yeah, we don't need to have a long conversation on it tonight, and I will say that I wrote it up, but it really was came up with, Eric is here, and he may want to just say something briefly about this. I think it would be helpful for those of us who are currently working on the design section to understand a little more about Table 11 and the zoning ordinance as we're trying to figure out what to put in the Saldo. So maybe someone wants to just give us a brief how this table came about and what its goals are, I guess. Particularly, it seems to mostly reflect existing conditions in.
I think it's an enumeration of existing street conditions, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It seems like, where there's a number of references to it in the zoning code that say any development must be in compliance with Table 11. So I guess the question is, are there situations, and I think the answer is yes, in which you'd ever want something different from that in a case of new development? Eric, feel free to chime on in.
Yeah, so if you can hear me, I'll kind of give my summary of what I see happening. So we have that Table 11 documents each street. It has street widths, it has right-of-way widths, it has sidewalk widths. And then we have a zoning code section that then also has sidewalk widths and various design parameters that we want. And then we also have a Saldo with the various sidewalk widths and road widths parameters. But there's various code language that refers back to using Table 11 as the road widths and the sidewalk widths, for development. And a perfect example was as referenced in the memo, is 650 Montgomery, sidewalk on Meeting House. It's a 4-foot wide sidewalk. Table 11 said 4-foot wide sidewalk. Code requirement says 6-foot sidewalk required in that zoning district, but the code language reverts back in a circle to 4-foot sidewalk. So I think the ultimate clarification that we want to get to is, do we recognize Table 11 as existing conditions, but then use our other code language in Saldo or zoning as what we want to be using in the future? There's just a few circular references, I think, in the code that in practice have been problematic and will continue to be problematic with the new Saldo.
Okay. A related question, Eric and Chloe, would be not just consistency in terms of the outcomes we're seeking, but where should any particular regulation properly be located. You know what I mean? Like,
Right, whether it belongs in the zoning versus the saldo.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a few other items that would be in that category of discussion as well, because that's this.
So I feel like this is just part of the picture. I mean, I guess one of the pictures is part is to sort out what belongs in zoning, what's in the saldo, and then make sure they're consistent, and make sure we're talking about the desired conditions and not the existing conditions, if the desired conditions are different. Probably, as you're working on this, there's a way that you can write sort of blanket language which says if there's a conflict, certain things should take precedence, right?
Right. You know, the new draft saldo doesn't have to refer to table 11 at all and can say, you know, have new requirements. There is this one issue that Eric just mentioned that's an existing conflict within the zoning ordinance that would require a change to the zoning too.
Yeah. The only thing I could say about that table, and I'm just guessing here, you can fill me in, is that one of the reasons the street widths or cartways are enumerated is because they're very unconventional. And that we don't want standard conventions that, you know, some national street design agency has decided, you know, imposed on how we design our streets here. So I think that, at least in terms of street widths, what we're trying to do is legitimize the street widths we have as appropriate for the borough, not have someone come along and say, like 114 Forest. Well, I'm designing on Windsor Avenue, so I want to make the street 3 feet wider. Because it's a narrow street, right? We don't want that to happen. So the reason for codifying, for putting the existing street widths in is because we like the existing street widths. So we wouldn't want anything to supersede that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this could be rewritten to be clear, and a couple of items, right? So one is, I think you're pointing out, table 11 probably should not be the reference point for design, but it could be the reference point for existing conditions, and then perhaps the ordinance could talk about, you know, the preferred cross sections, and where there's a conflict with existing cross sections, what the process would be to decide on the correct cross section to use. I personally would also like to see this represented with graphics, and I know even though the graphics may be illustrative, they should match. In other words, I think that the primary focus ought to be on the modules of the street, meaning the edge conditions for the sidewalk and the curb and the tree lawn, those pedestrian components, and then the configurations of the cartway, whether it has, you know, parking on how many sides and so on. You know, with definitely not over prescribing too much width in the cartway or the right-of-way, if that makes sense. But it should tie somehow to either an official map or the zoning, I guess, right, for preferred frontage types based on use. But I think that it would also help to find any errors to draw them, personally. But if that looks the way you want it to look. Because wasn't something in the memo about how there's no tree lawn on Meeting House Lane or something, so that...
Right, so there are illustrations of the street conditions. If I share here, is that a thing? Did they see? Oh, there we go. So there are these illustrations that go along with table 11. There's street conditions A through G, maybe? And the illustrations do say somewhere for illustrative purposes only, which implies that if there's something, text or table that contradicts something in the illustration, that would prevail. But here are examples provided for illustrations.
It seems like the drawings could be made to match the text. And then I noticed there's no utilities in the drawings here.
Meeting House is street condition A per the table, but it doesn't have these, what is it called here, planting strip. So it just, has, how helpful are the drawings if they don't match what the table is saying?
They're not helpful
How
if they
to
don't
work that
match.
out?
No, they need to match is my point. I mean, like, if they don't match, then why do we have them? Something's off. And then it would also, I mean, maybe, there might be a hard conversation about just because the town, certain things are, maybe they're fine the way they are, but maybe there's opportunities also to think differently. The tree strips are often quite narrow, and as the trees get big, they end up attacking the curb and the sidewalk and so on. So maybe going forward, we should try to set the sidewalk back further. When there's a chance to do that.
It's a little late in the game in many places. And also,
Well, let me,
the utilities are every which way.
Yeah.
Throughout Narberth. So sometimes there are utilities under the verge. So, and that's problematic. Sometimes the utilities are in the center of the street, sometimes they're along the edge of the street.
sometimes no one knows where they are until you
And
do.
often no one knows where they are, and as we found out when the new water lines went in, they often zigzag down the street. They jog, goodness knows why that is, but it's the existing condition. So I think when these illustrations were done, it was, as it says, the illustrations are for illustrative purposes, whatever that might mean.
Wishful thinking.
I've never understood what that means.
So, I'm not sure what,
Yeah, right.
if we can give conclusive advice about how to sort this out.
Okay, this has been helpful already so far. And if that's as far as we get, that's fine. I guess the remaining questions would be, I think I would recommend that we address in the SALDO the unlikely scenarios of a street being extended or a new street being constructed in the borough. I think they're unlikely, and I think we should still, at least at a cursory level, address them in our SALDO. And so looking for...
Does that need to be codified though, or can that be negotiated with standards?
My take there on the SADO is you want to establish a standard of what a road is, a width, a right of way, and have standards on it. But it gives you, in the case where you have an existing street or a project that's redeveloping a property, that can all be adjusted and tailored to that particular project. Because at that point, you're just dealing with a waiver, and you can establish that. But it gives you a standard that you can require if needed in the case of adding a new street at that point.
So you're saying, Eric, in essence, if you don't have a standard, you're sort of floating in the wind. But if you have a standard, that's a starting point for discussion. And if you want to change the standard, you can just issue a waiver.
Correct. Yeah.
If it's in the SALDO.
Right.
Not if it's in the zoning, then it's a more complicated process.
Correct.
Has been recommended to us in the past, I'm now remembering, I think John Walco recommended this, that many of our design standards should be put in the SALDO, not the zoning, for the very reason you're saying, because Narberth is such an old and quirky and impossible to nail down place. As Adam is suggesting, ultimately you are going to be negotiating things, and it's better to be negotiating from the point of view that if you're going to make a change, it's simply a waiver and not a variance or a... So that's another point, which is in the past we've been advised move just things about parking and cartways and driveways out of the zoning into the SALDO. Which procedurally gives us more flexibility down the road.
That is an option to move what's currently, table 11 and all those diagrams to the SALDO, and I think that would be
All I
pretty
can say is
reasonable to
that
do that.
the solicitors advised that in the past.
Sounds wise.
But I mean, I guess to this point about Meeting House Lane, how do you? So what would have been the solution there that for a commercial frontage should have a minimum sidewalk of 6 feet? Is that?
So what happened with Meeting House is there was a code requirement, it was in zoning, that a sidewalk had to be 6 feet. However, that it ended up that table 11 says it's 4 foot with 0 foot verge, and the developer said, well, that's what the way the code was written. That's what he had to provide, the 4 foot sidewalk that was there, because that was what was prescribed for that street. Whereas it basically took our legs out from under us with being able to enforce a 6 foot sidewalk.
There was a conflict in the zoning code. Two different rules conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you were saying move the sort of street standards to the salvo, because how often is someone going to build a new street anyway? And that way you don't have to do a variance. But we do need something in the zoning then, correct, right, for minimum sidewalk widths and frontage conditions, or no? I mean, in order to have something for the development application.
Right, that can be, again, in either zoning or saldo. We see both ways in terms of the minimum sidewalk width. And I think what you have in sections 701, 702, 703, and it specifies by zoning district the sidewalk width, I think that is good and it's appropriate for the development conditions that you may see. And that can remain in the zoning. If everything else moved to the saldo, then that would prevail. I mean, we should say it explicitly that if there's conflicts between those provisions and
I think what I'd like to see maybe is, let's just decide, maybe what we can decide is what would we like the standards to be? Mm-hmm. And then figure out, is that better in the saldo or the zone?
Right. So I guess that would be a good question. The standards that are by zoning district in section 701 of your zoning ordinance.
702.
Are those what you would like to see? Right, so that's basically 3A, 3B, 3C, 4A, and 4B, 4 foot sidewalks. 5A and 5B, 6 feet sidewalks. If you're happy with that, we'll adjust the code and make sure that that's what
I'm
prevails.
actually not sure that it's, I have to look at the map and so, right? Because when we had the application for Elmwood Avenue, if we think about Linwood Road, you know, I think you want a more generous sidewalk and you want that sidewalk to be set back from the curb based on the condition on Linwood Road, you know, and that's not about the land use type as it is about the combination of land use and the street.
Yeah, I don't know that a sidewalk width should solely be determined by the zoning district. It should be determined by the street.
Yeah.
As Adam was pointing out, the 3B district has streets that vary widely in their character, from, you know, Linwood Road to tiny little one-block streets, to some streets with no sidewalks, like Rockland.
That one too.
So this may, obviously this requires a lot more work. But I think the principle should be, if we can determine what the outcomes are that we want, then we can determine where it gets encoded, and that by nature will help us eliminate the conflicts. It might mean taking all the different code parts and putting them up on a wall and sorting them out. So.
And just so I understand, if the street design criteria are in the salvo, are they still applicable to a single lot development application?
One house on one lot, one dwelling unit on one lot, no. If
That
it's
would
more
just be
than
the
one,
zoning.
right. If it's more than one dwelling unit or any non-residential, then yes. But if it's
So there has to be something in the zoning that references this issue of curb and sidewalk and so on.
Right, for that reason. And driveways too, by the way.
Yeah.
I think driveways are a standalone section.
Right. Chloe, I'm not sure if we've moved you along.
yeah, I mean, yes and no. I'm just thinking, you know, we're trying to pull together a full draft of the design section to share with you, and our goal is to have it this month so that you could review it prior to the January meeting. And that's where a lot of this is going to end up going. We're happy to, you know, take a stab at it and try to make some recommendations. One possible way of dealing with this in the Saldo is to say everywhere requires a 5-foot sidewalk and a planted verge and a minimum cartway of 24 feet. And then when they come in, you say, actually, you don't have to put that in. You can leave the 4-foot sidewalk in there and you don't have to add the planting strip because it's nowhere else on that block, and just give waivers frequently for those items. But then that means you can compel them when you do want them. So that's the strategy. I'm sure it's the best strategy for Norbert, but it's not necessarily a bad one.
Yeah, because, well, you could predicate, again, it's predicated on the context, right? So the waiver is granted because it's contextual.
Right.
That's not a bad idea. It's very Norbertian in its quality, its characteristic.
The only thing I would say about that is, well, I mean, you know, if you recall, we denied 3M1 because of a waiver, which it may have been argued that was sort of one of those kind of routine waivers, you know, but we denied it. And so, you know, I'm not looking at it from the point of view of the applicant. Anytime I have to ask for waivers like that, then in fact, in another part of the code, you're suggesting that, or the borough manager suggested, if someone needs a waiver, they have to automatically ask for, submit a request for an extension. You know, so if you kick people in the waivers automatically, I mean, I don't know how I feel about it. I'm just saying from the point of view of an applicant, that may not be desired. I don't know if we can figure out that strategy for you tonight.
Yeah, that's fine. I guess the reason I mention that is that without further direction, that might be what ends up in our draft that you'll see soon. And that doesn't mean that it has to be where we end up with this. And I don't know, you know, Eric and I, along with Aaron and Kevin, we'll talk about this next week, and Michelle, and see what we come to. But that might be a kind of a stopgap, saying, okay, well, we can put this in here for now, and we can adjust, keep working on this and adjust it if we want to.
I mean, if you asked us to answer the questions specifically, is there ever a desire to widen or add sidewalks? I think the answer would be yes. There will sometimes be a desire to widen or add sidewalks.
Okay, that's helpful, because currently the way it's written in both zoning and Saldo is that Table 11 is king. All you have to do is comply with Table 11, which basically just reflects existing conditions, and then you're good.
Right, so we should have the ability to widen or add sidewalks.
Something needs to be changed. That's helpful to know.
Will there ever be new streets or extensions of existing streets? I have a hard time seeing that. I can see more likely it will be that there will be internal streets like alleys or driveways. I just can't imagine where there would be a new street. The only, like Hampton, I think there's a place you might extend the street, but it's already a right of way, I think. So I'm not sure that planning for new streets or extensions of existing ones is as important as thinking about alleys. And I think in downtown, we've already kind of thought about that we do want kind of internal streets, like alleys or driveways, to break up big blocks to allow for people to walk through and access to internal parking. So that seems to me to be really important to think about.
Could this apply to streets that are currently private ways that may become dedicated as public ways? Such as Lantwin, which doesn't have any sidewalks, I can think of. Price Crossing, those access roads are not public streets, but it's possible they could turn into public streets at some point, and we need.
Well, that's why I said we should think about driveways. I don't know, and I don't know what would happen. What would happen if one of those became a public street? I don't think they would automatically have to conform. I mean, I don't know. We'd have to find. I mean, if a private street becomes a public street, I would assume that's just sort of a negotiation. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think we can think of every permutation, Chloe.
Right.
I think it's not likely there'll be new streets. Maybe Jim's right. Maybe an existing private street will become a street. I think it's likely we see proposals for driveways all the time. And you know, I guess number 3, conflicting requirements for sidewalk widths and other parts of the ordinance. Obviously, we don't want conflicts, and we want the ability to ask for wider or more sidewalks if it makes sense.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the existing conflict in the zoning ordinance, just to keep in mind, I mean, you can consider including a one-sentence text amendment along with whatever next zoning amendment you adopt. But just dictate that a 702 prevails in case of a conflict for now, and then working towards it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful. Well, this will come up again.
All right. Okay. I do want to move on to the zoning changes we're talking about, so we're not here for a whole lot longer. So moving on to the next agenda item, discussion of infill housing and ADU zoning amendments. We are working on those in the same aggressive pace that the CELDO is being worked on. And our goal is to give to the borough staff, according to what Samantha and I have discussed, to give them direction to take all of our ideas and craft ordinance language. So where we stand with that is, you know, for the past few months we've been developing the kind of policy direction we want, and we've now begun to develop draft language for what could go into the language about accessory dwelling units. And, excuse me, we've developed policy guides. We got feedback from council last month, and now we're beginning to develop that draft language to give a bit of a head start to the borough staff on developing that language. And so what I'd like to do is get as far as we can tonight in giving to them a kind of framework for what we'd like them to work on. I think there will probably be some issues that we can't resolve about dimensions and things, but I think we can probably, we're probably pretty clear on the kind of framework for what we want the ordinances to say. So I'd like to tackle accessory dwelling units first. We have 2 things to look at. Jim has done some sketches to kind of further test our ideas, and so I'd like Jim could walk us through that. Does everyone have a copy of his sketches?
I got paper copies of it.
Oh, you did too? Okay. And then I have,
Do you have another one, Todd?
Yeah, I got tons of these.
I'll take
how many copies did I give you?
I don't know. How many pages is it?
It's 2 pages.
Oh, then we don't need.
Oh, I have a, yeah, I have
These should be destroyed, because this is some of the worst drawing I've ever done.
And I'm not sure we stand with the language we've been working on.
It's all crooked.
Okay, so Jim, why don't you walk us through what you did, why you did.
Okay,
what
so
you learned.
the discussion was, how big should an ADU be? And a suggestion was made that 800 square feet was too big and that we should consider 600 square feet. So I took it as my initial task here to test what 600 square feet would look like. And so this nifty little plan is a 600 square foot house on on one floor. A two-story house doesn't make any sense at that size, I don't think. I didn't even bother with it because a stair, a code compliant stair would chew up such a large proportion of the allowable square footage that it's sort of not worth even considering in my view. So here's a single story plan that is pretty minimal. I would not want to live in this unit because it ain't got no closets to speak of. Among other shortcomings, it's pretty minimal. That's what you get in 600 square feet, 24 by 25. Avails itself of furnishable dimensions. Living room is probably 12 feet wide, and that's a good furnishable dimension. It's got a type B accessible bathroom. Type B meaning it doesn't have to be fully equipped with accessible features, but it needs to be sized in such a way that accessible features could be included where they desired or required. And that translates into a bathroom the size of Rhode Island, which is seemingly outsized bathroom, at the expense of pretty much everything else in the unit. So there you have it, and the other drawing is a section. So it's got a living room. It's designed to be focused on the wall alongside the door, where the giant TV would go. Like that TV up that we're looking at right now. That's what everybody seems to want to have these days. So a seating group would fit in the corner. You'll note that there are no windows in this unit because if you have a big TV, why do you need windows? And there's a neat kitchen dining room, and a bedroom that's big enough for at least a queen size bed, with a very small closet.
There is a
I'm sorry?
There is a closet.
Barely, yeah.
There's a small closet.
Okay.
Yeah, big enough for your Dickens outfit.
You've been to IKEA, right?
Pardon me?
You've been to IKEA, see the apartments?
Well, the furniture, you might get a dresser in here, or a dresser combination dresser wardrobe unit in this bedroom.
No, it's not for everyone, but it's functional.
That's where we came into the last century. There were no closets. Many Narberth houses have no closets because everyone had wardrobes.
Yeah, virtually none.
So, and there's a little thing in the bathrooms called U, and that's probably a little utility closet that's a nod toward having a water heater.
So Jim, let me ask a question. So your finding is you can do a kind of tight little one-bedroom
Yeah, that's what it boils down to.
600 feet. So what if you said, well, that upper loft is where you sleep, then you actually would have room.
Well, there's no stairs.
Well, what I'm saying is then you would have room for stairs if you wanted to sleep in a loft upstairs.
You could design it so that there was a stairs up to the loft area.
Mhm.
Yep. And that what is drawn in the section. Oh, well, that's not for everyone, Todd. That's not. A lot of people wouldn't want to do that.
No,
I also suspect that a code compliant stair would blow away too many square feet on the ground floor.
Yeah.
That either the living room or the dining room or both end up being almost unusable, unfurnishable, if you lose that area for a stair.
Then you could put a closet underneath it.
So would that lead you to say...
It's a place for Harry Potter, too.
Yeah.
Would that lead you to say we should allow for a larger floor plate on the ground level?
Yes, that's the conclusion that I personally
provide
come to.
for stairs.
600 isn't the right number. 800 may be a little too much, but somewhere in the middle might be about right.
And when I did my test runs, I was using 800.
Right.
That was gross, so that included the area of the. No, it wasn't. No, that was net. The usable square footage.
This is gross. This is out to out. 600 square feet.
Now, if you made this 700 feet, or 800, or something in between 6 and 8, and you had stairs, you wouldn't have much left for an upper level, unless we also change that number. At that point, you're getting to a small house,
Yeah.
which is not the point of this.
I'm inclined to think that 800 is a better number than 600.
For a ground floor plate.
Yeah.
So does he.
Yeah, right.
Well, in this scheme, the loft is bonus space. That's where you
You
keep.
just have like a trap and.
Yeah, the four little dots in
Story from.
the hallway and the living room represent a pull-down ladder, maybe.
Well, it raises some interesting code issues that if all of a sudden you have a loft and somebody is using a pull-down stair and sleeping up there, that gets to be a
You
problem.
can't do that, Dave. That's illegal.
Yeah, I know, but that doesn't mean it's not gonna
But you know
happen.
what, I don't think that's pertinent. I mean, you could do that in any house right now.
Yeah.
So I don't
Okay.
think that's pertinent. What do you think of this analysis?
Well, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, why do we need a private bedroom? I mean, personally, an ADU is like a studio. I think of it as a studio apartment and not necessarily as a
Well,
one-bedroom unit.
Why do you need a private bathroom?
Why do you need a bathroom? Private bathroom? No, why do you, no, I mean, I really appreciate the plan
Let's
and I
outlaw
appreciate the
walls,
sentiment.
no walls.
But if we're trying to develop an opportunity for small houses, I think we
Well, I
we
mean,
don't go as big as
if you
800. I
have-
just think
if you have a-
that's a big house. That's a house.
if you have a couple living here, I venture to say most couples would want a bedroom, a separate one-bedroom unit versus an efficiency. I'll say after 40 years of marriage,
What's
I
the
do.
purpose of an ADU? I guess that's the question.
Well,
You know, I mean, is it to allow a couple to live there? I mean, it's a small, it's an accessory dwelling unit. It's a little tiny apartment.
well, I think that's a good question. Now, when I looked at when I first looked at this, you know, as Jim said, I don't think I would want to live here, but on the other hand, if the idea is to provide a minimal opportunity to do something like this, well, it kind of sort of works.
I mean, look how many motel rooms people live in. No, seriously, I mean, it's the same idea. You know, you can hang out in a motel room for several months at a time if you're working on a project. I mean, it's the same idea, really, and it's much bigger than that. So, I guess,
A lot of motel rooms don't have cooking though, so that's where I think.
yeah, a lot of them do. You know, they have a kitchenette.
Yeah, well, they do it within like 2.5 feet.
Yeah, well,
A dwyer unit,
similar to this.
Remember those?
What's S? What is S?
storage, some sort of
Oh,
storage.
okay. So, no, I mean, I think it shows you that you could live in this square footage,
600.
personally.
Well, I think the conclusion, as Jim said, is 600 is the absolute positive minimum, I would think. I can't imagine getting any lower than that. You know, so then the next question is, well, is it 800, is it 7, is it, yeah.
Wait, why couldn't you imagine it going lower? I mean, like Heidi was saying, another option
Okay.
would be to have a studio.
You're right, you can certainly have an efficiency in under 600.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
When we did units for historic landmarks, I think we were getting to like 450 in some
And less.
units.
The question is not how much smaller does someone want to go.
Right,
It's is it necessary for us to have a larger threshold to make this practical? That's
Yeah.
the question.
I think so.
If someone wants to build a 300 square foot ADU and live in it, that's fine. The real question is it 600, 700, 800? Jim's saying 600 is kind of tight. You might want to give it more room. What do you think, Adam? You've got a good head for.
I think we shouldn't over-prescribe, and there aren't that many large sites available. So in order for the ADU to have application, I think that you have to leave some room for creativity on the part of the person that's going to construct it and use it. And I think part of that creativity would include using the loft space. And I realize that the stairs are a complication and some people can't go upstairs and so on, but that's also the way to maximize the minimum floor plate, is with the loft.
But are you saying, I guess
I wouldn't set a minimum size that's too large. Personally, I wouldn't do that.
well, as a matter of just getting down to brass tacks, are you looking at this sketch, which is really all we have to go on, do you sense that 600 feet makes sense, or do you feel like Jim's right, we should push it up a little bit? If we're going to have
Well,
like
I thought it seemed like there were two things being discussed, whether there was worry about having structures that were too large, and then the other worry about having structures that are too small. It's kind of this Goldilocks discussion, and that's what I'm saying.
Don't worry about structures being too small, because let people build structures as small as they want. The question is, from the point of view of the design of the town, I don't think it really matters how small a house is. The only reason it matters how small it is whether someone wants to live there.
Right.
And if someone wants to build a small house and try to find someone to live there, then that's okay. The real question is, how big is too big in terms of filling out yards and lots and so forth? The thing is, we're giving people a lot of benefits to build these. They don't have to have a parking spot. That's a big benefit. And so we don't want people to sort of just start squeezing in extra houses for this. So the question is, what's the size to balance the need for smaller affordable housing versus not just giving people an opportunity to just build a whole other house in their yard and not have a parking spot?
Well, I think also we're just trying to define what an ADU is.
Well, that's right. What's the difference between a
So
house and
this
an ADU?
room is 20 by 30.
Well, yeah, I was doing.
You were counting tiles?
Yeah, what's shown here comes from about that wall to the sprinkler heads over there, and it's just a little wider
Yeah.
than what we got here. I'm not sure if that helps an
But
awful
if you
lot.
think about it that way, to
conceptualizing
me,
it,
that's a pretty big building. So, I mean, are we saying that, so are we trying to, if we're saying nothing's too small, we're trying to indicate or dictate the maximum?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So do other elements of the code already enforce that? Should that be governed by things like impervious coverage ratios?
Our impervious coverage ratio is so generous that it's not a factor. And to redo the impervious coverage will be a whole other project.
Yeah, even using 800 square feet, I didn't come close to hitting any of those limits.
Now, building coverage might be an issue. Building coverage might be something people bump up against.
Well, I didn't think the drawings you did last time posed huge concerns. Am I misremembering with those site plans that were done? And those
Concerns in what way?
Those were 800 square feet, you're saying?
Yeah, you mean concerns in overdeveloping the site?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like I said, they fit. I think one of the examples may have started to come close to the maximum building coverage, but for the most part, they didn't really get close to being an issue.
I mean, they were chosen as large lots specifically to look at this, so.
For the most part, yeah.
Well, this is sort of interesting. I have a table on my computer, which is what is the maximum coverage allowable in each zoning district per lot size, right? And my math might be wrong, but we have this process by which you get a lot of square footage for the first small part of your lot, and as your lot expands, you get very little additional square footage. That's how it works, right? So in the 3A zone, for example, if you have a 20,000 square foot lot, almost half an acre, you only get 2,625 square feet of building coverage. Which means, if you think about 20,000 square foot lot, that's probably got a generous house on it, right? You may not have enough building coverage left to put an ADU. So in fact, to Adam's question, the building coverage might be what might be what controls. And the numbers might be a little wrong. So 3%.
Yeah, and so could we calculate that lot by lot now that we have this building coverage?
Yeah, we can calculate lot by lot. But I mean, I have a formula that calculates it every 100 feet, every 500 feet. So.
Well, I just know we could compare how many parcels actually have surplus buildable area.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. we do that.
Before considering constraints like trees, utilities, other things that may, you know,
We can get that right away now.
But again, if we're not going to legislate the minimum area except as needed by the building code, you know, there's a whole trend now to small houses.
Yeah.
I mean, which are, you know, only a few hundred square feet.
That's, my assumption is that almost everybody is going to be able to build an ADU.
Yeah.
AARP was, I forget, and I mentioned the Vermont method, right? But it was like I want to say there was a square footage or a percentage of the main structure. That was their control. So if you have a really big house on a really big lot, you can have a really bigger ADU, right? I think, if I'm remembering it, because it's proportional.
Yeah, there's a few examples like similar things like that, where there's a maximum square footage for an ADU, but also some restriction relative to the principal building, like it can't be more than half the size of the principal building, or it can't be more than a certain percentage of the height of the principal building, or other restrictions like that.
So it sounds like we still need to analyze this a little more.
Can I mention one more thing that, from listening to the council meeting recently, they were approaching this question as a side benefit being a way to legalize ADUs that already exist in the borough. And a number of those that I can think of are fairly large. Like there are a couple of, you know, they just are there, you know. And if we set a maximum size for an ADU, or will those fall out of compliance? Like will they be grandfathered? Or
No, they'd have to be
they
grandfathered.
would?
So that brings me, so let's set this aside, because I think maybe with the numbers Jim's just dug up, we could do a better analysis of this. I mean, we can develop the structure of the code and fill in the number, or not even have a number later. So I think we need to work on that more. But what I passed out to you was a way that we can edit our code to allow for accessory buildings, and it's got two parts really. One is how the current section on accessory buildings could be amended, which essentially allows accessory buildings to be used for residential purposes, and then new language that is specific to accessory dwelling units. And this, I'll just read this out to you because I think it covers one of these points. So what I would propose is we see if we're comfortable enough with this, at least to turn it over to have it polished up as actual code before we finally recommend it. So number one is an accessory dwelling can only be created on a lot with a detached house or a twin. So you can't put an accessory dwelling on a lot with an apartment building or multifamily house.
Okay.
Second, you can only have one accessory dwelling unit on a lot, and the number of dwelling units on the lot can't be more than 2. Which means if you have you can have a detached house that has 2 dwelling units in it, but you can't have 2 in your detached house and then add an accessory dwelling unit. You already have your extra unit in your house.
So you're saying one per parcel, basically?
Right.
So within the structure or external?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Although we already allow it inside the structure. It's
Right.
already by code. So what we're only doing is extending that same prerogative to outside the structure.
So we're saying if you have one inside the structure, you don't get one outside.
Yeah, you
Right.
can't get a second ADU.
Right.
Makes sense.
Then And that really is from council. At a certain point, we stop making what we think are the best solutions, and we listen to what council has to say, what they would like to, you know, they're balancing what we think versus what they're hearing in the community, and that's the direction we have from council. An accessory dwelling unit can be located in a structure that also includes a garage. Above, next to, again, Dave has to meet the whatever code requirements are necessary. No additional lot area is required for an accessory dwelling unit. So you know how you have to have 6,000 square feet for detached house, or 3,000 square feet for a twin. You can put an accessory dwelling unit on there, but you don't need any more square feet for your lot. That's a benefit of having an accessory dwelling unit. The building area and impervious coverage of an accessory dwelling unit shall be included in the calculations of building coverage and impervious coverage for the lot. So you can't exceed those limits.
Right.
Then there's a maximum building area of an accessory dwelling unit, which we're debating. An accessory dwelling unit must be in the second or third lot layer. Can't be in the first lot layer.
That's weird with Rockland, just for the record.
What do you mean?
The garages, are they in the first lot layer on Rockland, or are they in the third lot layer?
They're in the third lot layer of Marion.
Okay.
Unless, it depends what the house is addressed on.
Okay. Well, all right, fine. Sounds good.
Yeah, when we talk about this with the historic district, it's wherever the front of the house is, that's the first lot layer, and the rest of the lot, it's all relative to the
Okay.
front
Just
side
want
of
to
the
make
house.
sure. Thank you.
Yep.
So this gets to what you were just asking. An accessory building an existing accessory building that's non-conforming in regard to side yard or rear yard setbacks, building coverage, impervious coverage, building height or building height may be converted to an accessory dwelling unit, as long as the accessory building does not exceed the maximum area for an accessory dwelling, and as long as no nonconformity is increased. So what's proposed here, Jim Spear, is if the accessory building is bigger than the maximum size of an ADU, which we were just discussing, then you would not be allowed to convert it. Because what we don't want is people like building a 2,000 square foot garage and then saying, oh, I'm going to convert that to an accessory dwelling. It's okay, even though it's bigger. So I don't know what to do about that. I mean, if someone has a 1,000 square foot garage and they want to turn it into an accessory dwelling, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. Because again, what we don't want is people to just use an accessory dwelling to essentially build a house, right?
Would they have to partition it off somehow? Or?
Subdivide it.
I think we're overthinking this personally.
That's because other people are paid to overthink it.
I guess.
No, I think that's a good question. You know, and my take on it is, by definition, you can't have an ADU larger than whatever we decided to be. So you can't take a 1,000-foot garage and make it into a 1,000-foot ADU. I don't know what the answer is or what you do with that extra 200 or 300 square feet.
Just chop it off.
Yeah, I don't know what, but I would say that
Perfect car.
But if they submit an ADU taking that whole square footage, that's not in compliance with the code.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just see that the ADU, if you end up with a maximum, right? And again, AARP was like the 800 square feet or 30% of the main building. If that's the maximum, then the envelope, you just have surplus envelope left over, right?
30% of main building or 800 feet, like whichever's greater.
Whichever's greater,
whichever's less.
It's whichever's greater. That's for that's one of the examples. Because again, it's under the assumption that larger buildings do exist. In some towns.
Yeah. So.
Or it could be whichever is smaller, if that's more appropriate for context of
No,
our.
yeah. No.
I wouldn't want 30% of a 1,000 square foot house.
Yeah. Right, no, that would,
Narberth's a little different, because I think probably that, those codes might be written for places that are involving places that were platted.
Well, it's 800 square feet or whichever is greater. So if you're, again, if you're dealing with a large house on a very large lot, you may already have an accessory garage that's pretty large. So
There's one house that claims to be 7,000 square feet.
What we don't want is someone to build a house and call it an accessory dwelling. That's the thing.
Right.
So if you have a 5,000 square foot house and you get 30% of that, you build a 1,500 square foot ADU, that's like building a house. And that's not what we want. We don't want people to build. I mean, that might be okay in, Pleasanton, California, where all the lots are 7,000, houses are 7,000 square feet. But I'm not sure that's okay in our area. The maximum height of an accessory dwelling should not exceed 2 stories and 16 feet. That's what you drew in, Jay.
Yes.
Remember, when we talk about building height, folks, the building height is the midpoint of the roof.
Yeah.
So you could actually have a building that functionally is like 22 feet high, or 20
Right.
feet high. It's just the midpoint of the roof.
That's how I drew it, Tom.
Yeah. Accessory dwelling unit does not require parking space. The main door of an accessory dwelling unit must be connected to the street by a sidewalk. The owner of the property must reside in the primary building or the accessory dwelling unit on the property. That's what's written here. I thought of one other potential rule to consider, which is, in the case of Dave, when you drew the one on Wayne, where you showed an accessory dwelling unit in front of the house,
Yeah.
that if an accessory dwelling unit faces a street, it should have a frontage.
Mm-hmm.
And that the accessory dwelling unit and the house itself cannot exceed the frontage requirement
Right.
of that lot.
That's,
So you
yeah.
can have it face the
That's a
street,
good
you can
point.
have it in front of the house, but you have to have a frontage, like a stoop or a,
doesn't have to be in the
Yeah.
second or third lot layer though?
it could still be in the second or third lot layer.
Could be in
If
the second
house-
lot layer.
There's some situations where the house is really set far back.
Yeah.
Like Dave, we studied one on Wayne Avenue where the house just has to be set incredibly far back from the street. And you can build a accessory dwelling unit next to the house and in front of the house. And it's still in the second lot layer.
It's pretty much built on its own rear property line.
Yeah, it's like right up against the rear property line. So the only place to build an accessory dwelling unit is next to the existing house and in front of it. And so in that case, you'd have a frontage, and so that's the only other rule I thought of. So those would be the rules
Right.
that we could then just turn quickly into code. And the only thing I think we have to work out, and I think with Jim's data, we can do a lot more analysis now, is do we want a maximum floor plate or size or ADU? I think we can say that needs more analysis. But that shouldn't stop us from going ahead and trying to see if we can codify this. Well, if you think of anything else, much this up and send it back.
Sorry, anything about landscaping or site planning or, no? Okay. Trying to think if there's
Are you
something.
tweaking us?
Pardon?
Are you tweaking us?
No, I'm just trying to make, it's sort of like, I feel like it's at an auction here, going once, going twice.
Oh, no, you can, we have plenty of time to, like I said, if something else comes to mind. I've talked with council members about tightening up the landscape code, but I think, like, that belongs in the landscape code, not in the zoning code. Like, for example, if you do infill housing, you have to convert part of your lawn to, like, native vegetation or something like that. But that's not for the zoning code. That's more for the landscape or the street tree code. It's interesting. I work in a lot of communities where they have what's called a uniform development ordinance, and all of this, landscaping, stormwater, subdivision, zoning, it's all in one code. Not here.
In Pennsylvania or other places?
Other states.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think it's common in Pennsylvania.
No, because our legislature is so busy on far more important things.
Can't have uniform codes.
Okay, so let's see if we can talk for a couple minutes about the other infill development and get some directions we can move that along as well. And I didn't print out as many copies. And what I want to try and do is like flag a few things. I only have 3 other copies because my printer wasn't printing fast enough. So I did email this to you all.
Yeah, I think I have it on my computer.
Maybe I have it too from 11.
Yeah, 1125. So what I tried.
It says 11.
Well, the title of the file is 1124.
Okay, then I have it. Okay.
So what I tried to do is organize how we would codify what we've agreed to for infill and historic districts. And so the first page just sort of is a checklist. So I'll skip that. The second page is, for this to work, I'm suggesting we create a new zoning district called a historic district overlay, which would be coterminous with the historic district. And these rules would apply only in that overlay to houses which are contributing uses. And that would be that. So that's a way of saying these rules only apply in historic districts. So when the historic district changes, if it gets bigger or smaller, this would automatically change. There's been a lot of conversation about whether some of these ideas aren't good enough to apply everywhere, and they might be, but I think for the time being, council expressed, first of all, it took a little bit of persuading for council to even be interested in this infill, and they expressed a desire to move very incrementally, and so I think this is a first step to getting these ideas into the code, and then we can evaluate whether, for example, cottages belong elsewhere. And for now. So then the next page, page 3, is about the cottage housing type. And the kind of amendments we would need to make to allow for that. There's amendments in site planning, the site planning table. And this pretty much codifies what we discussed, the minimum lot size of 3,000 square feet. The maximum floor area is a new standard. We talked about 1,800 feet.
It's actually page 2.
Page 2? That's page 3 on mine.
Yeah, on mine it's
I don't have it
It
at
got consolidated somehow. It's number 500-401.
It's on page 3 for me.
I'm to introduce the cottage housing type.
I'm happy. It's not.
Yeah, I don't have
I'm
it
happy
either.
with the electronic version that I have.
I am too.
Okay.
But I am intrigued by what 211125 is.
Yeah, you can, it's just formatted differently. The same information, but it's spread out.
25th of November.
Well, okay.
Less interesting.
So I guess what I'm suggesting here is that to make the cottage work, we would need to amend the site planning table. Now, any of these dimensions we can still tweak, but this would be the process of amending the code. We would have to create under section 502, 500-502, there's where we enumerate the different building types. We'd have to create the new building type, the cottage, and describe it. And one of the things I think we would include in that description is we would only permit one household to occupy a cottage, as opposed to the detached house, which could allow 2 households in it, and that we would not permit conversions of cottages to multifamily houses, whereas the detached house can be converted to a multifamily house. Does that make sense?
Well,
Yeah.
maybe it'll come up when we do fill in the numbers, but we were talking about how many units a lot could support, and we were thinking about that would also be the number of cottages that a lot could support. So how do you turn around and then convert the main house back into a multifamily residence when you've already used up your units on
You
the
couldn't.
cottage? You couldn't.
Right.
Okay.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay, good. Carry on.
By the way, Jim, these rules are presuming you are subdividing your lot and creating a new lot for a cottage.
Oh,
There's the next one, we then go to building form, which includes building height. And here, we debated this last time, but here the proposal is that the height of a cottage should be 22 feet. But again, that's the midpoint of the roof, so your cottage might actually be, what, 26 feet, 28 feet, depending on, I think the idea was that if someone was clever and wanted to have a partial third floor in there, I don't know if you could do that at 22 feet. But the other point was that the cottage should be smaller than a detached house. So I think 22 feet is where we landed. Again, we can, up until the time we recommend this to council, we can continue to tweak the heights. But, so those are really the things I think we need to do the code to introduce the cottage. Amend the site planning dimensions, create a new building type under building design, and then change the building form rules for building height.
And I would also add, I mean, there is something in the code about roof slope.
Yes. Do you feel like different roof slopes are appropriate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying, does anyone know offhand what it is about, there's something in there about twins having a different roof slope, or, but it's,
talking about it.
yeah, I mean, it's in the code somewhere, and I didn't write it down here, but typically these small houses on small lots could have a shallow roof.
When it says roof slope, I mean, is there something in there for Dutch gambrels?
What? There is something in here about, is it 12 and 12?
What about like a Dutch
8
gambrel?
and 12, 8, 12, oh, that's what it is, it's 8 and 12 and 5 and 12. It's 8 and 12 for the main roof and 5 and 12 for secondary roof. And all I'm suggesting is that these should be allowed to have 5 and 12 roofs. Or less.
Roofs.
Because that would be difficult, that is
This is the roof
in
section.
our.
I thought you'd go for flat roofs again. You'd have fight it off
Well, not
flat roofs.
totally flat, because they leak.
So
you found it in here.
are you, that section C I think is where the roof requirements are.
Yeah, primary roofs are 8 and 12, and secondary maybe 5 and 12. Oh, with ridges located equal or less than 35 above the mean pre-development grade of the frontage shall be pitched a minimum of 5 and 12. Whereas if they're more than 35 above the mean pre-development grade at the frontage line, it would be pitched 8 and 12. What? 35 what? Feet?
Yes.
Well, I guess that needs to be fixed.
Heidi, why don't we say this? If you feel like a smaller house, either the cottage or the twin we're going to talk about, needs a different roof,
I think it should be allowed to have a flatter roof.
a flatter roof?
Flatter, yeah, less pitched.
Okay, well, if you can figure out a way to express that and bring it back to us.
Okay, I'll take pictures in numbers.
Okay.
Because there's lots.
Because we need to have language for that.
Okay.
Then the next section, the next page deals with width and lot size requirements for twin houses. We agreed in our last meeting that we could probably reduce the minimum lot width to 22. I wrote 21 here, but when I listened to our meeting, we said 22 feet from 25. And we talked about a minimum lot size of 1,800 feet. So this just sort of takes that, which we discussed, and suggests that we would amend the site planning table to allow for that. One thing I noticed is in the, hang on a second, here,
It's 22 by 82 feet.
which is an odd lot size, actually. We allow a minimum of 2,000 square feet in the 4B, 3,000 in 3B, 3C, and 4A. So now we would be allowing 1,800, just noting that. I feel like we don't want a bigger lot because then we get even weirder proportions. And then again, the building height would be 22 feet, which, since it's a twin, that would be the midpoint of the roof, but the one side could be the highest point, like the house, like the twins you see on Chestnut Avenue, for example. So it may be possible to get is that enough to get a third story under there, or should we make it a little higher? Or is that, that's another thing we were
So
doing.
that's the whole point, I think you're gonna keep them smaller.
Yeah.
No, is that provision, or are some of these intended to be not only for homes on historic properties? I mean, is that going to be for twins generally, or you're talking only in this infill
Only in this infill. at this
situation
point.
with the historic
Yeah.
contributing? Okay.
Later on, we can figure out whether it makes sense elsewhere. But now
Yeah.
it's just in the
I
historic.
was just wondering about like that provision in particular.
Next page, section 4, talks about provisions for planned development, which permits multiple primary buildings on a lot and allows for site planning flexibility. So Jim, this is what you're asking about. And so what this proposes is a new section under site planning to accommodate this with several provisions. One is more than one principal building may be located on a lot. Principal buildings may be any building type that would be allowable in that zoning district already. So you can't use it to put a different kind of building in, just one that would be permitted already. Now here's a key one. The total area of the lot must provide for the lot area that would be required if each primary building were on an independent lot. Which means if you had a lot, say in this example it says 15,000 square feet. You could have a multifamily house with up to 5 units, or you could have 2 detached houses, or you could have a combination such as 1 detached house and 3 cottages. But whatever amount of square feet you would need to have a particular building on a lot, you would need to be able to add that all together, even though you're not subdividing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So on a 15,000 square foot lot, you could fit 5 dwelling units, potentially. Or
So-
if you're twins, you could fit even more.
And then what about impervious coverage?
Well, impervious coverage, first of all, there's building coverage, which we talk about in impervious coverage. Impervious coverage, we allow 60% impervious coverage.
That's right, that's flat.
Which is
Yeah.
another matter we should look at one day. Now we can look at it, now we have just, but that's not proposing to look at that right now.
Yeah, I meant building coverage.
So building coverage, that's the next item. We talked about that last month, which is that the way our building coverage works now is you get a decent amount of building coverage for a first portion of your lot, and as your lot gets bigger, you get very little. So there's an incentive to subdivide a big lot because you get more building coverage.
Right.
So since we want to give people the opportunity to create infill houses in exchange for preserving their house, we should probably reconsider the allowable building coverage to permit them to infill. So the question is, what's the metric you use for that, right? And last month we looked at a couple of metrics. One is that under the previous zoning code, the building coverage was a flat 35%. In the residential zoning district. So that's one metric to think about, is 35%. Does that make sense? Then we looked at some developments that were approved under the old zoning code, a Price Crossing and the Presbyterian Church. I think the Presbyterian Church wound up being 30% building coverage, and Price Crossing wound up being 20% building coverage. But that's because that lot had steep slopes, and so a lot of it wasn't buildable. I don't know how you would calculate that on the top part of the lot, but you can see it's probably closer at least to 30 or maybe even 35. So you're looking at this 30, 35. 146 Marion, which was the tentative plan that was approved, I think came in at 41%. So those are really the metrics we have, right? 30, 35, 40. And I think what we, going through our minutes, and I realized I sent you the wrong file, we kind of discussed that somewhere in that 35, potentially 35 to 40 range, somewhere in there might be appropriate in this circumstance, in that area. But we don't really have any. Now with Jim's numbers, we can do a better analysis of that. So while the number of units couldn't be more than you'd be allowed to have now, the building coverage would be more than you could have if you kept your lot in whole, but less than you could have if you subdivided your lot. So it would be somewhere in between. If you could, I mean, that's what's proposed here. And the trade-off is that this is in exchange for people preserving housing. So I think what we can do is we can use Jim's data to try and come up with a better proposal for what that number ought to be, but somewhere in that range. The frontage line should be the frontage that's required for the block that the lot faces. So that's pretty straightforward. Setbacks from side and rear lot lines should be the same as required in the underlying zoning district. But setbacks, there should be no rule for setbacks between buildings, except for what the building code would dictate. So the zoning code has nothing to say about the distance between buildings on the lot, but it has something to say about the back and side yard setbacks. That's what we've discussed. That gives you the flexibility, like you could put your buildings closer to have more open space, or a driveway or parking. New primary buildings must be built on the frontage line so that the aggregate frontage of the buildings meets the minimum frontage for that lot in that district before buildings can be put in the rear of the lot. That means that if you're filling in on a lot, the preference is to fill close to the street. However, that requirement can be waived if there are things like trees or topography or floodplain or other features that make it not desirable to fill close to the street.
I think you can just write into zoning that council can waive the requirement of zoning.
Well, that's why we're going to give it to someone to write
They'll
it.
figure it out. Wouldn't have
Our
you
goal, so this is what we'd like to
Yeah.
accomplish. Someone who knows a little bit more about it can figure out how to write it. We did discuss a metric for facade requirements, which is that each building individually needs to meet the maximum facade requirement. Each primary building must have a pedestrian connection to the street. Parking requirements can be met through any on-street parking spaces adjacent to the lot or parking anywhere on the lot, except inside a separate primary building. So what that means is, say you, just for the sake of argument, you have 4 cottages on a big lot. You can meet your parking by parking along the curb you could have parking anywhere on the lot to serve those 4 houses. The only thing you can't do is say, well, attached to one house, I'm putting a 4-car garage and everyone's going to share that garage. You can't do that. You can't have an indoor parking spot attached to someone else's house.
It has to be a separate building.
It would have to be attached to your house or separate, yeah. That's the only thing you couldn't do to meet your parking requirement.
And why is that? Because it makes it too big a structure, or? I mean, if you're meeting the build-out requirements.
Okay, that's a good question. I think it could be impractical for a person to have a garage in someone else's house.
What about like a carport or like a semi-open structure?
Attached to someone else's
Yes.
house.
I feel like it gets to be more like an apartment building.
It does feel apartment-like, that's true.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, it feels to me like it's more like a multi-family situation.
It's like the caretaker has the.
I mean, we want, yeah, we don't want building type. I mean, I guess the one way to look at it is parking is an accessory use, but only if it's serving that house. I don't know if you can have parking that serves someone else's house in your house. I don't know if we'd allow that.
Okay.
Well, if you can think of a good reason why that shouldn't be a rule, we should discuss it.
Well,
That's what you do when you have your 10,000 square foot ADU and you don't know what to do with the extra square footage.
The other people park.
You make it into a parking garage.
So you put right Maserati.
And lease it out.
Squash court.
So there's 2 other parts of this. Section 5 deals with how to deal with these big lots if they are through block. And we've had 3 situations. That's on Marion to Rockland, Norbrook Park to Conway, and then although they're not big lots, we have 3 block lots on Grayling, New Hampton. Right? I think those are the only 3 places in the borough. Are there any in your neighborhood? So,
La La Land?
what's that?
What, in La La Land?
So there, what this proposal is, so what we've talked about is we need more flexibility in those situations. So what this proposes is that first it establishes the primary frontage is the street that the existing house on the property faces. Because we're in a historic district, there's always going to be an existing house that faces the street. So that's the primary frontage. And then the other side of the lot is the secondary frontage. That's just a definition. And then the setback on the secondary street, the rear street, can be determined through one of several methods at the discretion of council, which we can talk about that whole mechanism in a minute, based on which approach most closely reflects the mean distance that buildings on the secondary street are set back. So it could be, you could use the existing requirement for rear setbacks for that lot. So like, if you're thinking about Marion Avenue, for example, the rear setback is 15 feet. So you could say buildings on Rockland would have to set back 15 feet. Or you could say, no, you need to use the frontage requirement for that secondary street. So that's about 28 feet from Rockland Avenue. Or you could say, you could just measure the mean distance that all primary and accessory buildings are set back from the curb line and take that as your depth. So the point is you have different options. And you can look at it and pick which one makes the most sense. The rear setback, front setback, or just an average. And the reason it's at the, let me just finish. The reason it's at the discretion of council is we do have a precedent for that in determination. You know, there's a provision of our code where it says if a building's on the corner, you have to determine which is the front and which is the side. And that's, although the code states a preference, council is given the authority to make that determination ultimately, and its approval of the project. And so I'm suggesting we use that same mechanism here. All right.
So they get to decide project by project.
Yeah.
Okay, understood.
We have a precedent for that for corner lots. Where there's ambiguity, council
Okay, I got it,
can make a decision in that situation. And then the only other part of this is something actually Chris Young pointed out to me, is that, again, we're just talking about situations where we're trying to permit infill on a lot where there's a historic house. Again, the premise is we want to give people the opportunity to use their land productively, since we've taken away the opportunity to demolish their house. And so it has to do with how you calculate parking spaces along the street. So, you get a parking credit in the 3B and 3C district. You don't get parking credits in the 3A district. You get them in the 3B and 3C districts based on your curb frontage and based on a metric which is established block by block by block. So what this is proposing is you calculate that before your subdivision, not after your subdivision. Because if you calculate it after your subdivision, you might wind up with weird fractions that prevent you from using all the parking spots. So you can calculate it before your subdivision and then allocate those spaces to your area. Because what we're trying to do is like encourage narrower subdivisions, like 22-foot lot for twin, which might be inconsistent with getting a parking spot, right? So it's not fair. It seems counterproductive to our goals to say, well, we'll let you create a smaller lot, but sorry, you lose your parking spot, so you have to have a garage.
I just have an observation. Has anyone noticed that hardly anybody in residential development takes advantage of those parking credits? Like, there's only one house that was built that takes advantage of it. Every other house is building a 2-car off-street parking garage.
That's the market for you.
Yeah.
Well, one day we can decide whether we want parking maximums, but that's a different.
Those guys at Sabine who are building that new twin, I tried to get them to take their parking credit. They wouldn't. They wouldn't take it. Oh well.
So those are the.
It's the American way.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's what
Not for long.
there's planners who are advocating for just eliminating all parking requirements for ordinance. And that's why, because the developers feel that there's a need for parking, they'll build it.
Yeah.
If there isn't, they
Well,
won't.
where else are you gonna put your workshop or your?
Well, actually,
Bicycles, that goes with your house.
that is the thing to me, is that if you get a curb cut that takes away a curb street spot, right, and you have this garage and this driveway, it's a little bit irksome when people don't use it, and then they park on the street because they've actually then doubled it bigger. Anyway.
That's how it used to be in Norfolk. That's what made us change that. People would have to build curb cuts and driveways if they just wanted to build an addition to their house. It's crazy. So we lose a public spot on the street to gain a private spot off the street. It made no sense. So those are this I think is almost everything we've talked about before, but sort of organized by section, by code. And I guess what I'd like to know is if you're comfortable taking the next step and asking staff, solicitor, to see if they can translate this into.
Yeah.
I mean, we can, numeric things we can always jigger.
Mhm.
So if there's things you want to work on, we can still work on them as long as we have a good answer soon. Then the only other thing I'll note we talked about is, we did come to a resolution on this, is to fix the way facade size is calculated, to take into account all facades in the second lot there, not just the first 6 feet. We had a little disagreement, we couldn't come to a consensus on that in our last meeting. So since it's late, what I'd like to suggest is we pick that up again. It's a pretty simple fix if we can come to a consensus on that. So, we didn't. So I think we should try to see if we can come to a consensus and slip that into this next revision. But we need to agree. So I would like to talk to Samantha Bryant tomorrow or this this week about how we can kind of take the next step with this and then bring it back in a more polished version. I think if there's metrics you still want to look at, Jim has now found data that will help us get at a lot of these metrics. And so if you have questions you want to frame up, let me or Jim know so we can kind of come back with the data that will help us make a better decision about some of the metrics that we are still fuzzy on. You know, and we can develop the code language while we're finalizing the metrics.
I suggest that if you do a parcel capacity analysis, if you give that to the county GIS team, they should be able to map it.
Map it up to what?
A map.
Oh.
Instead of just having a list of addresses, you can put it, feed it back into the parcel map.
Actually, I didn't tell you this, Jim, but I'm auctioning off a free tattoo of a zoning map of Norwood. It's a donation for charity. The lucky winner will get it mapped on their
Temporary tattoo.
on their back.
That'll be convenient for reference.
That's right. That's right. That's good to know, and I'm sure we can ask.
Is this yours or this mine?
Okay, is there anything else tonight? And, are there any members of the public in the
I saw a couple.
Let's
No one
ask.
left. Ira's here.
Just Ira.
Ira, we're at the point now where we're entertaining public comment. Would you like to make any comments?
Well, I just wanted to make sure that you saw, maybe you already addressed this and I missed that there was a comment in the chat.
No, I did not see that comment.
We never look at that.
I
Well,
saw it and was thinking that the infill housing discussion would really answer the question.
What was the question?
So it says, curious about the ADU concept. These are tiny homes, super hot now, affordable housing. Wondering specifically if it can be an individually owned unit in a condominium or must it always be accessory to a specific individual structure?
So we can, yes. Go ahead, sorry.
No, there's more and it'll tell you more about it. One of the options we're looking at for the 146 Marion project, ADU on floor 2, garages for it, and other condo units on floor 1. Thoughts? This is from Joe Havlick.
I don't know, is Joe still on the line or not?
No,
But we can answer.
he's not.
I can provide an answer to him offline. But
Yeah.
we did propose this to council, and council determined that they were more comfortable with the ADU being occupied by someone related to the property owner. So council.
Right, it sounds like he's talking about a 3-unit building with a unit on the upper floor and 2 or more units on the first floor or something.
That would be a multifamily house.
Right, that's not, that's why, yeah.
A multifamily house can be leased to 3 different households, or sold, or condo to 3 different households.
Right. It seems like the ADU discussion isn't really relevant to what he's asking, but there's.
Well, if the question is, could ADU be occupied either as a condominium or as a rental to a third party, the answer would be no. Council, in giving us direction about this ordinance, said it would be their preference for the ADU to be occupied by a relative of the person who is the property owner. And that's a policy choice that council gave us direction on.
Blood relative.
Well, I guess we'll have to work that out in the fine details, how that works.
I'm sure they will accept public comment on that.
Chloe, actually, you've informed us that most municipalities in Montgomery County ADUs have some sort of provision like that, so I'm sure you can inform us as to language.
So what happens when you run out of blood relatives?
Like that Alec Guinness
You
movie.
just go to Whole Foods and get a new one.
So you're
Just add water.
And then if someone has multiple units in a house, like a multi-family house, then obviously that can be leased or condominiumized to 3 different households. We don't have any rules about that.
There's no rules.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, Joe, if you're listening that we didn't answer that, but I'll make sure to get back to him. All right, are there any other questions or comments?
Can I just clarify, so like, if you had an accessory dwelling that was attached to your house, that could be occupied by someone, not a blood relative, right? Like any detached
If you have a detached house with 2 units in it,
Yeah,
it could be 2 households.
yeah.
Yeah.
Even if it's entirely separate from the other, from the main house. As long as it's contact in the house, apparently it's fine to be occupied by anybody. But if it's detached, council prefers that it be a blood relative.
Correct.
Can I just clarify?
Got it.
Wait.
Because there's 2 things. One is the blood relative and one is the owner occupied. Council wants both?
I
Or
think
just wants one of the units to be owner occupied?
it has to be occupied by a relative of the owner. What that means is something we just need to figure out. They don't want it to be a party who's unrelated.
Okay.
I don't know
I'm
whether
just-
that includes a niece or a nephew or a sibling. We didn't parse that with council. We'll have to parse that.
And since a house can be occupied by up to 4
Wait, I want to stick with Chloe. No, I want to stick
No,
with
I'm sorry, I'm
Chloe's
still
question.
not clear, because this document says the owner of the property must reside in the primary building or the accessory building. So they want that also. The owner has to live in one of the units, and the other unit has to be
a relative.
occupied by a relative,
Yes,
both things.
yes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
What happens when I'll say it again, what happens when you run out of relatives?
I don't know.
See, I think this is an unworkable idea, because you're gonna start out with your granny living in the accessory unit, let's say, and then she goes to the great beyond. Now what do? Oh,
So,
well, there's another person, there's an unrelated person that wants to live, and you're gonna say, no, you can't do that, because they're not.
we don't need to debate this. We've already made the recommendation to council that that's a bad idea.
We have, okay.
We have. And Jim, all those arguments you made, I made to council in this
Yeah,
room
I just did.
2 weeks ago. And they didn't buy it. I said, in the zoning code already, you can have 400 or 500 unrelated individuals in a house. In the zoning code already, you can have 2 units in a house. But that did not win the
Okay.
I'm
day.
sure council will still accept public comment at a council meeting.
Yes.
One way or the other.
Yes, and so what I suggest is council's given us direction to write this code. And if we want to get something passed, ultimately council gets to decide what they vote on, right? And so we have to respect that. And council is trying to balance what we've presented to them as good planning ideas versus what they believe the sensibility of the community is. And that works in leaps and steps and whatever. So we can continue to offer council our best advice, either as individuals or even as a commission. We can send this and say, we still think it would be better if you did it that way. But council's requested that the code be written this way. So when we transmit it to them in our letter, we can say we've written it the way you've requested it. We still recommend this is better. You can testify at the meeting if you want. But that was the direction we received. For the very reasons you're saying. Because you are right.
Well, then, I don't know, I know I'm not needing to convince you, but we keep recommending to communities that they don't have this blood relative requirement because the enforcement gets very sticky into things. You're forced staff to, ask people to prove bring their adoption papers or their marriage records or get genetic testing. It's this kind of thing you don't want your staff to have to deal with.
Gosh, you found out you're not related at all.
Right, that's not something you want to be in the middle of,
That's the
right?
last time, that's not how you want to find out.
And when you get into enforcement, it tends to be something that's both unpopular and uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for all those reasons, I
That doesn't-
think we did recommend that, but that's what
Yeah.
the council asked us to bring back.
Got it.
Understood.
Um,
And you're right that a number of other municipalities do have that requirement. So,
Yes.
so,
I really,
Common, even if we
the
don't
perception I got from the council meeting is council wants to be mindful of the perception of the rate of change that's occurring and wants to try to encourage change but not make people feel like things are changing so rapidly that they won't recognize what's happening. They are elected to make those decisions. So we respect that. Okay? All right, I have a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
Jim moves, second. Dave seconds, all in favor of adjourning at 9:38 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Okay, and I wish whatever holidays, you, if any, you will be celebrating over the next few weeks.
Too late.
But you're done celebrating?
Good job.
Okay, isn't that
Kind of got ended and sent back.